She stood alone beneath the glittering chandeliers, while everyone whispered. Eleanor Vance, Duchess of Ashworth, stood near the gilded pillar with a glass of untouched champagne, her ivory gown luminous against the shadows. She had been married to the Duke for 11 months, and in that time she had learned to read a ballroom the way sailors read an approaching storm. Tonight the air was thick with pity. The other ladies stole glances and then looked away too quickly. A baroness she barely knew offered her a smile that felt more like a funeral wreath. Eleanor kept her chin high and her hands steady, even as the truth burned behind her ribs. Her husband had not spoken a single word to her all evening. Alexander Ashford, the Duke of Ashworth, moved through the room like winter made flesh. Tall, dark-haired, impeccably dressed in midnight blue, he commanded attention without effort. He spoke with politicians and laughed softly with an ambassador's wife. He refilled his brandy and passed within 3 feet of Eleanor without once turning his head. She had become a piece of furniture in his life, something expensive, something invisible. The humiliation was slow and quiet, the worst kind. Eleanor could feel it seeping into her, drop by drop, until her heart felt too heavy to carry. She had entered this marriage with a foolish, fragile hope. Her father, Lord Vance, had been a respected but impoverished earl who died 6 months before the wedding. The Duke had offered for her hand swiftly, almost dutifully, and her grieving mother had wept with relief. No scandal, no ruin. Just a cold, distant savior who looked at Eleanor as though she were a debt he was still paying. She had tried. Goodness, she had tried. She learned his household rhythms, spoke kindly to his staff, wore the colors he once mentioned in passing. She waited up for him on nights when he worked late, only to have him walk past the drawing room without stopping. She wrote him small notes that were never answered. She had kissed his cheek once, 3 months into the marriage, and he had stiffened like a man touched by flame. After that she stopped. Now she stood at the ball, watching her husband exist in a world that did not include her, and she felt the last of her hope fold quietly away. The music swelled. Couples moved to the floor. Eleanor set down her glass and walked toward the terrace, needing air that did not taste like perfume and rejection. She passed clusters of guests who did not bother to hide their whispers. Poor thing, he never even looks at her. My cousin heard the marriage was forced, something about her father's debts. Can you imagine, tied to a man who cannot bear the sight of you? Eleanor pressed her palm against the cold stone balustrade and stared into the dark gardens. Tears threatened, but she refused to let them fall. She was the daughter of a proud man, and pride was the only inheritance she had left. She would not weep in public. She would not give them that. She was still standing there, breathing slowly, when she heard her husband's voice. It came from the open window of the gentleman's card room, low and rough with brandy and exhaustion. She would have walked away, should have walked away, but she heard her own name and froze. "Eleanor," said a voice she recognized as Lord Ridley, a longtime friend of the Duke. "Good heavens, Ashworth, you barely glanced at your wife tonight. The gossips are feasting." A pause, then Alexander's voice, weary and flat. "What would you have me do? Pretend it was a love match?" Eleanor's stomach turned to ice. "Was the marriage truly necessary?" Ridley asked. "You could have refused her father. Plenty of men would have." "I made a promise," Alexander said, and there was something bitter in it. "A promise I have regretted every day since. She is a constant reminder of a decision I cannot undo. I have done my duty. I have given her a title, a home, protection. I cannot give her affection I do not feel. She will always be the mistake of my life." The words did not fade. They hung in the air, sharp and solid, and Eleanor felt each one strike with terrifying clarity. The mistake of my life. She did not remember moving. She simply found herself walking back through the ballroom, past the gawking faces, past the maids, into the cold carriage that waited outside. She sat in the darkness for a long time before her lady's maid found her, and when the maid asked if she was unwell, Eleanor only said, "Take me home." She did not cry that night. She lay in her vast, silent bedchamber and stared at the canopy until dawn painted the ceiling gold. The tears would come later, she knew, But something else came first. A quiet, steel resolve she had not felt before. She had spent 11 months trying to earn the love of a man who considered her his greatest regret. She would not spend a 12th. The morning after the ball, Eleanor Vance made a decision that would quietly alter the course of Caldwell Hall. She rose early and wrote a letter to her mother, telling her she was well and that the Duke was as attentive as ever. It was the first of many lies she would tell to protect those she loved from her private humiliation. Then she called for the housekeeper, Mrs. Platt, and asked for a complete report of the estate's tenants, those who lived on the farthest edges of Ashworth land, the ones often forgotten. Mrs. Platt, a sharp-eyed woman who had served the Duke since his boyhood, hesitated only a moment before nodding. "I shall have the steward prepare the records, Your Grace." "No," Eleanor said softly, "I will visit them myself." She began that very afternoon. Wearing a simple gray dress and a thick wool cloak, she took a small unmarked carriage to a cluster of cottages where the roofs sagged and the children ran barefoot. She met an elderly widow named Mrs. Thistle who had not received her firewood allowance. She met a young farmhand whose leg had been crushed by a cart and who had no means to see a physician. She met mothers who were running out of hope. Eleanor did not offer grand gestures. She sat and listened. She brought bread and clean linens. She wrote notes in a small leather book, names, needs, quiet sufferings, and she promised nothing, but she returned the next day and the next. The tenants began to speak of her in hushed, grateful tones. "The young Duchess has a gentle way," they said. "She remembers your name, she sees you." Back at Caldwell Hall, her absence was noticed slowly. At dinner on the third evening, Alexander looked at the empty chair across the long table and frowned. "Where is her Grace?" A footman stepped forward. "She dined early in her sitting room, Your Grace. She has been visiting the outer tenants." Alexander said nothing, but his jaw tightened. He had been avoiding her for months, and now that she was not there to avoid, the emptiness felt oddly pointed. He finished his meal alone. The clink of silver against porcelain unnaturally loud. That night he walked past her door and heard no sound, no soft humming, no rustle of pages. He told himself it was relief. He did not believe it. A fortnight passed. Eleanor's days grew full and purposeful. She organized a donation of wool blankets from a merchant who owed the estate a favor. She convinced the local physician to visit the outer tenants once a month at her personal expense. She even began teaching a few village girls to read, using books smuggled from the manor library. She felt useful in a way she had never felt as a decorative duchess in a ballroom. Her heart still ached, but the ache was buried beneath activity and small kindnesses. She no longer waited for Alexander in the drawing room. She no longer listened for his footsteps. She had stopped hopping, and in that release she found a strange, quiet freedom. Alexander did not understand what was shifting until Lord Julian Blackwood arrived for a visit. Julian was a botanist and a painter, the younger son of a marquis, with kind hazel eyes and an easy laugh that filled any room. He had been invited to catalog the rare flora in the Ashworth woodlands, a project Alexander had approved months earlier and promptly forgotten. Julian was charming without effort, the sort of man who knelt to speak to a child and complimented a servant's garden. When he arrived at Caldwell Hall, the household seemed to breathe a little lighter. Alexander greeted him with polite distance. "I trust the East Wing suits you." "Exceedingly," Julian said, smiling. "Though I confess I am far more eager to see the woodland orchids your steward mentioned, and I understand her Grace is quite knowledgeable about the local flowers." Alexander's expression flickered. "You have met my wife." "Only by reputation." Julian's smile held nothing but warmth. "The tenants speak of her as if she were a saint. I hear she visits the cottages nearly every day. I hope she might guide me to the best patches of bluebells." Before Alexander could respond, Eleanor entered the hall, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She wore a practical day dress the color of heather, and there was mud on the hem of her skirt. She stopped at the sight of Julian, and the surprise softened into a genuine smile, the first smile Alexander had seen on her face in weeks. "Lord Blackwood," she said, offering her hand. "Forgive my appearance. I was with the miller's daughter. She has the croup." Julian took her hand and bowed low. "Your Grace, you look like a woman who has been doing good work. I would rather see a little mud on a duchess than all the silk in London." Elinor laughed. It was a bright, spontaneous sound. Alexander's fingers tightened around the letter he was holding. He had not heard her laugh in months, maybe ever. It did something strange to his chest. That evening at supper, Julian dominated the conversation with stories of his travels, jungles in the Indies, mountain flowers in the Alps. Elinor listened with glowing eyes, asking questions, laughing at his self-deprecating jokes. Alexander sat at the head of the table, a brooding silence wrapped around him like a cloak. He watched his wife's face, the way it came alive under Julian's attention. She had never looked at him that way. Why would she? He had given her no warmth to reflect. Every smile she offered Julian felt like a silent accusation. Late that night, Alexander stood by the window of his study, staring at the dark gardens, and heard his own words echoing back from the ball. "The mistake of my life." He had said it to deflect Ridley's prying, to bury the truth beneath a layer of cold indifference. But the truth was far more complicated and far more painful. He had wanted Elinor long before the marriage. He had seen her 3 years ago at a country gathering, a girl with quiet dignity and deep gray eyes, and he had felt something he had sworn never to feel again after losing his first wife in childbirth 6 years before. He had buried that feeling. Then her father had fallen ill, drowning in secret debts, and had begged Alexander to save his daughter from ruin by making her a duchess. Alexander had agreed immediately, not from duty alone, but from a desperate, terrified hope that he could keep her safe without letting her close enough to break him again. So he had built walls, high, cold walls, and now she was drifting beyond them and he did not know how to call her back. The weeks that followed were a quiet battle Alexander was losing without knowing the rules. Elinor no longer sought him out. She no longer hovered at the edges of his day. If they passed in the corridor, she offered a small, polite nod and continued walking. Her dinner conversation was brief and impersonal. When he entered a room, she no longer looked up with that heartbreaking flicker of hope. She simply accepted his presence like weather, something to be endured, not enjoyed. One afternoon, he saw her walking in the garden with Julian. Julian had a sketchbook open, showing her something, and she leaned closer to see. Her hand rested lightly on his arm. Alexander's chest tightened. The jealousy arrived not like a fire but like a slow, cold dread. He turned away before they could see him. That evening he asked his steward about her activities. The steward, an honest man, reported that Her Grace had reorganized the tenant support system, halved the number of families going without firewood, and established a small school fund. She had done all of this quietly, without once asking for Alexander's help. He felt pride and shame in equal measure. She was becoming the Duchess of Ashworth in every way that mattered, and he had played no part in it. The turning point came on a wet November morning. Elinor had ridden out to deliver medicine to a remote farmstead, despite a rising storm. Alexander only learned of it when Julian appeared at the breakfast table, looking concerned. "I thought Her Grace would have waited," Julian said. "The roads will be rivers by noon." Alexander put down his fork. "She went alone." "With a groom, I believe, but the storm is growing worse." Something cold and sharp twisted in Alexander's stomach. He stood abruptly. "Saddle my horse." He found her on the narrow lane that wound through the Ashworth woods. The rain came down in slanting sheets, turning the dirt to mud. Her carriage had thrown a wheel, and she was standing beneath a tree with the groom, soaked through and shivering but calm. When Alexander rode up, his coat flying, his face pale with something that looked very much like fear, she stared at him in disbelief. "Alexander." "Get on the horse," he said, his voice rough. "Now." "The groom." "I will send help. You are frozen." He pulled her up in front of him, wrapping his heavy cloak around her shaking frame. She was small and cold against his chest, and he held her tighter than he had ever held anyone. As they rode back toward Caldwell Hall, his heart hammering against his ribs, he spoke close to her ear. "You cannot do this. You cannot risk yourself like this." "The children needed the medicine," she said, her voice thin. "You matter more," he said, and the words came out raw and unguarded. "You matter more than any of them." She went still in his arms but said nothing. Alexander closed his eyes briefly, feeling the rain on his face, and knew that the walls were crumbling. He had been a fool, a coward, and he was running out of time. Elinor fell ill. The chill from the storm settled into her chest, and by the next morning she was burning with fever. The physician was called, an old man with steady hands, who ordered rest and warm broths and constant watch. Alexander did not leave her doorway. He sat in the chair just outside her room, listening to the maids come and go, listening to her labored breathing. He had not slept. His cravat was undone, his hair disheveled. Lord Julian came to offer his concern, and Alexander dismissed him with a curtness that bordered on rude. He could not bear to see another man's worry for her. She was his wife. His. The word echoed in his mind like a bell. On the second night of her fever, when the physician feared it might worsen, Alexander pushed past the maids and knelt beside her bed. She was pale and damp with sweat, her dark hair spread across the pillow. She looked fragile in a way that terrified him. He had lost one wife already. He had sworn he would never let himself feel that terror again, yet here he was, drowning in it. He took her hand and pressed it to his lips. "Elinor," he whispered, his voice cracking, "please, please stay." She did not wake. The maid who stood in the corner turned away, eyes wet. Alexander remained there all night, holding her hand, speaking words he had never dared to say aloud. He told her about the first time he saw her. He told her about his fear, his guilt over his first wife's death, his stupid, stubborn determination to keep Elinor at arm's length so he would never have to grieve again. He confessed the real reason he had agreed to the marriage, not duty, but desire so deep it had frightened him. He told her that she was not the mistake of his life. She was the only thing that had ever made him wish for a second chance. He told her all of this while she slept, and when dawn came, her fever broke. Elinor opened her eyes to gray morning light and the sight of her husband asleep in a chair pulled close to her bed. His hand was still wrapped around hers. His face was haggard, unshaven, impossibly vulnerable. She stared at him for a long moment, trying to understand what had happened. The last thing she remembered was the rain, the strong arm around her, and his voice saying, "You matter more." A maid slipped in and smiled tearfully. "His Grace has not left your side in 2 days, Your Grace. He would not let anyone else tend to you." 2 days. Elinor's heart, which she had so carefully locked away, began to beat in a new, unfamiliar rhythm. She did not know what to think. She only knew that something had shifted. Later that morning, after she had sipped broth and the physician declared her out of danger, Alexander came to her properly. He stood in the doorway looking as uncertain as a boy. She had never seen him like this. The arrogance was gone. The distance was gone. He looked at her as if she were something precious and fragile. "May I sit?" he asked. She nodded. He pulled the chair close but did not take her hand this time. He simply looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed. "I need to tell you something, several things, and I need you to listen." Elinor's throat tightened, but she nodded again. "I heard you," she said quietly, "at the ball. I heard what you said to Lord Ridley, that I was the mistake of your life." Alexander closed his eyes as if the words were a physical blow. "I know. I saw you on the terrace after. I have replayed that moment 1,000 times. It was the cruelest thing I have ever said, and it was a lie. A stupid, cowardly lie I told because I could not face the truth." "What truth?" Her voice trembled, but her gaze held steady. He took a breath. "My first wife, Lydia, died giving birth to our son. The boy lived only hours. I lost them both in one night. After that, I swore I would never love again because love meant loss and I could not survive another loss. When your father asked me to marry you, I saw a chance to protect someone without risking my heart. But I failed. Because I already loved you, Alina. I loved you from the moment I saw you 3 years ago, and it terrified me. Every kindness you showed me made me want to pull you close, and so I pushed you away instead. I thought if I kept you at a distance, you could never be taken from me like Lydia was, but I was wrong. I was so wrong, and I almost lost you anyway. The silence stretched long. Alina felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but she made no move to wipe them. She thought of the cold months, the loneliness, the quiet death of her hopes, and yet here he was, offering the truth she had never expected. "I have been so alone," she whispered. "You made me feel invisible. You made me feel like a burden." "I know," his voice broke, "and I will spend the rest of my life making it right if you will let me. I do not deserve your forgiveness, but I am asking for it anyway. I love you, Alina, not out of duty, not out of guilt. I love you." He reached into his coat and withdrew a letter, old and worn. "I was going to give you this after the wedding, but I lost courage. It was written by your father. He knew I loved you. He made me promise to be patient with myself, but I broke that promise. I broke everything." Alina took the letter with shaking hands. She recognized her father's handwriting instantly. The words blurred, but she caught phrases: "a good man, a wounded man, give him time, my darling girl," and she understood finally the secret that had shaped her marriage. Her father had not sold her to save the family. He had placed her with a man he believed would love her, eventually, if only he could heal. The second unexpected reveal came when Alexander, his voice barely a whisper, told her one more thing. "Your father was not in debt by accident. My uncle blackmailed him, threatened to expose a family secret, something that would have destroyed your mother's honor. Your father paid to keep it quiet, and it ruined his finances. When he lay dying, he came to me and confessed everything. That was the promise I made to him, to protect you from that scandal, to keep your family's name clean. Marrying you was the only way to shield you completely. I wanted to do it, Alina. Please believe me. I wanted you." She stared at him, her mind reeling. The debts, the sudden marriage, his initial kindness that had frozen so quickly, it all rearranged itself into a new, heartbreaking picture. He had been carrying a burden she had never known existed. He had sacrificed his freedom not out of obligation, but out of a hidden, tangled love. "I believe you," she said at last, and her voice was raw with all the grief and relief she had held inside. "I believe you." Alexander moved then, not with the careful distance of a duke, but with the desperation of a man who had been drowning. He knelt beside the bed and took her hands, pressing his forehead to them. "I will never make you feel invisible again. I swear it. I will be the husband you deserved from the start, if you will have me." Alina looked down at his bent head, at the strong shoulders that had carried so much alone, and felt the last of her protective walls crumble. She had built them so carefully, stone by stone, to keep out the pain. But love was not about keeping out pain. Love was about letting someone in despite it. "Then stand up," she said softly, and when he lifted his tear-streaked face, she smiled, a real, warm, hopeful smile. "Stand up and kiss me, Alexander. We have lost enough time." He rose slowly, as if he could not quite believe what he was hearing. Then he cupped her face in his hands, so gently, and pressed his lips to hers with a tenderness that spoke of new beginnings. The kiss tasted of salt and relief, and something like spring after an endless winter. When they drew apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you too late," he murmured. "No," she whispered, "just in time." The healing did not happen overnight. Love did not erase the memory of pain, but it softened it. In the weeks that followed, Alexander learned to speak the words he had kept locked away for years. He walked with Alina to the tenant cottages, carrying the firewood himself, and listened as she introduced him to people whose names he had never bothered to learn. He saw the way they looked at her, with admiration, with gratitude, and he felt an immense, quiet pride. Alina, in turn, allowed herself to be loved. It was not easy to unlearn months of rejection, but Alexander's patience was unyielding. He left her notes on her pillow, small sentences that made her heart flutter. You smiled at breakfast and made the whole room brighter. He sat with her in the garden while she read aloud, and he did not flinch when she teased him gently about his brooding expressions. Slowly, laughter became a regular guest at Caldwell Hall. Lord Julian Blackwood departed for the Indies with a knowing smile and a sketch of a rare orchid he named Eleonora. He bowed low to the Duchess before he left and said, "I am glad the orchid found its proper sun." Alexander, standing nearby, only nodded, but his hand found Eleanor and held it firmly. There was no grand ball to announce their reconciliation, no public spectacle. The Tun whispered for a while, nodding that the Duke of Ashworth now rarely left his wife's side, that he looked at her with an intensity that made matrons fan themselves. But the couple paid no mind. They were too busy building a marriage from the ruins of a cold beginning, brick by tender brick. One evening in late spring, they sat together on the very terrace where Eleanor had once stood alone in humiliation. The gardens below were lush with new blooms, and the air smelled of honeysuckle. Eleanor leaned her head against Alexander's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, drawing her close. "I used to stand here and feel like I was disappearing," she said quietly, "like I was a ghost in your house." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "You were never a ghost. You were the only real thing, and I was too blind to see it." She turned to look at him, her gray eyes soft. "Promise me something." "Anything. If fear ever makes you want to push me away again, tell me. We will be afraid together. That is what marriage is, I think. Not the absence of fear, but sharing it." Alexander felt his throat tighten. He thought of Lydia, of the tiny grave beside hers, of the years spent running from love's shadow. Then he looked at Eleanor, alive, warm, steadfast, and nodded. "Together, I promise." The stars began to appear, one by one, and the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth remained on the terrace, wrapped in a silence that no longer felt empty. It was filled with all the words they had finally said, and all the years they had ahead to say more. The past had left its scars, but the future was soft and open, like a lantern glowing in a window, guiding them home. And in the cottages across the estate, the tenants lit their own candles and whispered blessings for the kind Duchess and the Duke who had learned to love her. The wind carried the scent of bluebells through the valley, and Caldwell Hall stood peaceful beneath the starlight, no longer a house of cold walls and hidden grief, but a place where healing had truly begun.